Department. Yeah.
Okay, I think this is working. Yes.
Yep.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the Holiday Forum in the Manship School. I'm Len Apcar, Professor Len Apcar. It's good to see so many familiar faces and to have two great guests to talk about one of the great tragedies of the year last year in Uvalde, Texas. This is a learning discussion because there's so many elements to covering a national crisis like this that it's good to break this down piece by piece, story by story, literally hour by hour, of not only what was happening and what the information flow was like, but then the days that followed, and so much more in terms of political investigations, law enforcement investigations, and all the other things, which and the ethical questions about publishing some of the material and eventually showing some of the video of what was going on in the school when the shooter was in it. We'll get to all of that. So we will also start with the basics, really, which is I'll introduce our two speakers. On my far left, Manny Garcia, who is the editor of the Austin American-Statesman, has been an editor for lots of different publications. Before he came to Austin, he was at ProPublica, which is a great investigative nonprofit that does terrific work. And before that, he was in Florida at the Naples Daily News. Naples Daily News, which is a paper, newsroom size, about the size of the Austin American-Statesman in Austin. He got his degree, he was telling me, at Florida International University, taught by a group of adjunct editors from the Miami Herald.
Oh, wow.
Who basically assigned him a beat and assigned him another beat and assigned him another beat until he got his degree and just kept going. And his first job was, no surprise, Miami Herald, listening to the police scanner into the city of Miami, which is probably, if you watch my CSI or any of the TV shows, you can imagine what the police scanner is like in Miami. Here is Tony Plohetski. Tony was the main reporter for the Statesman in Uvalde. He'll tell you what was happening the day he got the phone call to go down there from Manny, I presume.
Yes.
And what he thought about in the 2.5 hours as he was driving, listening to the radio, to decide how do you cover an event like this where every major network, all the cable news operations, all the big media, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune are there as well. What is the space for the Austin regional paper? They'll talk about that and how they thought about it. And Manny will talk about how he directed his team and how they sorted through what the stories were going to be, how the package comes together, and how do we deliver a cohesive explanation of just a completely chaotic scene. So with those introductions, I'd like to move just to Tony to set the scene. The phone call comes. Talk about that. Talk about your ride down there, and talk about when you got there, what did you think? What did you see? And how did you begin to think as a reporter? I think all the students would want to know, how do you begin to move as a reporter to get the contacts you need and to let people know that you're not from NBC and you're not from CBS News, but you're there too, and you need information just like they do.
So, as is customary with these big life-changing events in communities across the country and across our nation, I mean, it was an ordinary day. I know that sounds like a cliche, but I'd gone that morning to get a haircut and was working from home that afternoon, and had started seeing some very early reports on Twitter about a school shooting in Uvalde. The truth is, the initial reports reported 2 injuries, and so I thought this is something to keep an eye on. Uvalde is not in our historically traditional coverage area, so in that way, I did not immediately kind of mobilize. Manny called me a short time later and said, do you have any sources who can help us figure out what's going on in Uvalde? And so my first call was to a top official with the Texas Department of Public Safety who said, I don't know anything about death toll, but I can tell you this is going to be very bad. And saying that out loud still gives me chills to this day. And I called Manny back immediately, and I said, you know, this official is saying that this is going to be very significant. I think at that point I said, I'm going to start thinking about going, but I'm going to try to make a few more phone calls. And I called a top source in the governor's office for the state of Texas and said, what do you know? And he said, at that point, he said there are 14 students at this elementary school who have been killed. And I knew then this was going to be a national nightmare and a national tragedy, as it turned out to be. So at that point, I called Manny again, and we keep each other on speed dial, by the way, and called him again and said, you know, this is what I have, and I think I'm going to, these are my sources, this is the information I have, I think I'd like to go with it on Twitter. And so I'll just show you, because Twitter was such an important part of how we got initial breaking news out. You can see this tweet was at 3:24. Law enforcement sources say they're expecting a significant death toll at the shooting in Uvalde. And then followed up with that just a few minutes later. As many as 14 students are feared dead, according to preliminary reports provided to top state officials as well as the shooter. This is unfolding in Uvalde. And I was really terrified for the next few minutes, because you can see some of the commenters to that tweet were like, the local media is only saying 2. Why are you saying 14? And I started getting this immediate blowback on Twitter and actually got very, I mean, I trusted my sources, but to be the one who is first telling the world that 14 students are believed dead, that is something you would never want to have wrong. About 15 minutes later, the governor made a public statement and he confirmed that 14. So at that point, I said to Manny, you know, I'm hitting the road. Which, by the way, if you are an aspiring journalist or are a journalist who is young in your career, and something like this is happening in your coverage area or next to your coverage area, you never want the bosses to tell you to go, right? You always want to be the one to initiate yourself and propel yourself to go to a coverage area, because it's really important. And I think it's really important in those moments to really show up for the news outlet you work for, but also to show up for the community and for the state, and in this case, the entire nation. So I hit the road as I could. I made phone calls along the way. Uvalde is 2.5 hours away from Austin, so it's not something, you know, where I was there in just a few minutes. By that point, I started getting phone calls from national networks, including MSNBC and PBS NewsHour, who were asking me to do phoners with them. So I pulled over a couple of times to do that. And then I arrived in Uvalde to a really tragic, chaotic scene just as the sun was setting that night.
Can you sketch in a little more details? Were the network trucks there? Was it clear that they were going to start anchoring shows from there? Where did the local police put you? They obviously cordoned off the building. By the time you got there, the shooter was dead.
Right.
What access did you have physically, and what access did you have to information?
So my first stop was actually on the town square of Uvalde. You know, many Texas towns, and towns across the country for that matter, but especially in Texas, have these like historic, beautiful town squares. So Uvalde is one of them. And we had a colleague of mine who had been there, and I wanted to go there because at that point, townspeople had come out and they were having prayer vigils and praying out loud and trying to sing songs and comfort each other as best as possible. So that was actually my first stop. But I quickly then went to the campus. And one of the things about a tragedy and covering something like this is that, when you first get there, on the day of, the networks and the CNNs of the world and the MSNBCs of the world, they typically have not had the opportunity to deploy their whole army of people. And so at that point, the town was not saturated as it quickly became with journalists from all over the country. I did know that that was going to happen. Of course it was going to happen. Separate kind of tip, just for in case you're ever in this situation, that I have learned over time. Keep in mind, Uvalde is not Baton Rouge, right? It's not New Orleans. It is not a town that can absorb quite literally hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists. So one of the things that I did very early on was to book a hotel room, like in that town, and that is a really important thing to do. The CNNs of the world, they have people whose literal job it is, when there is something like this to happen, to pick up the phone and start booking the hotels. Not only does the press do that, but the FBI does that and other federal agencies. So hotel rooms in a small town like that are gone in a flash. So yes, I stayed at the Motel 6. Yes, it was awful. Yes, it was the last room that was available in the town, but I was really fortunate and thankful to have it. Because access and proximity is really, really important in situations like this. You are working from sunup to well past sundown, and you're lucky if you eat a power bar and take a shower, once a day. So proximity to some conveniences are really, really important. But once I got there, it was clear that it was a major crime scene. And I immediately went to work. I started trying to interview people, just townspeople who were outside the school at campus. It had not been hugely cordoned off at that point. There was definitely a police perimeter, but not in the same way that it became the next day, where they really pushed everybody back some significant distance. But when I say I went to work, I tried to find the person on the scene who also was able to provide information. By that time, the Statesman had actually started a live blog that we were updating constantly. Let me just see if I can find this here. Here it is. So our education reporter, Megan Menchaca, sort of was taking feeds from reporters in the field and other feeds from other outlets, for that matter. But I found this guy, Lieutenant Chris Oliveras from the Texas Department of Public Safety, and went up to him and said, what is the latest? And at that point, he told me that authorities had actually significantly raised the death toll from 14 to 19 students and 2 teachers. And so I knew Megan was operating this live blog. And so I called her and gave her this information. This was around 9 o'clock at night. And then I also work in partnership with our local ABC station in Austin. And so that was at 9 o'clock. And then at 10 o'clock, I did this brief just within the last shot. hour, authorities raising the death toll among the children here, Robb Elementary, tragically from 18 to 19, and also confirming that 2 teachers, 2 school employees here at the elementary school are among the dead as well. 2 major investigations unfolding here tonight. Of course, authorities are trying to learn everything they can about what may have precipitated the shooting that happened here today. But tragically, they are all. One thing I just want to point out in terms of like what's happening is, you can see we're pretty close to the school, but I want you to notice, just so you know how this goes. Do you see the guy in his arm and the burgundy short sleeve shirt there? Like, in terms of television reporters, that's how close everyone was at that point. So, we're cramped in there, and I'm wearing those earbuds so I can hear not only what's happening at the station, but it's really difficult to concentrate when you're in a situation like that, because the guy to my left is doing something, the guy to my right is doing something, and so it's hard to have your thoughts collected when literally you have two people, you know, doing the same thing next to you.
So you have a blog, it's running, or
A live blog,
a
yeah.
live blog. Manny, you still have a newspaper and a deadline. What did you do that night? How much information could you pack into it? Did you push deadlines back at all? Do you
Yeah.
have any flexibility to do that? And as you're describing that, can you also talk about your contact with your reporters
Sure.
on the ground, and how you were just thinking about day one for the paper and then for
Yeah.
the blog and the web?
By the way, Megan Menchaca, who was running that live blog, she's maybe 2 years out of journalism school. So understand that very early in your career, you're going to be thrown into things that normally would take 5, 6 years. So it's the importance of having discernment and calm in these situations. So going back to the start here, I heard the reports on TV that there could be a shooting, school shooting. Tony called me at that point, and that, how bad is it? Make some calls. We hear it's going to be really bad. At that point, it was mobilizing as many people as possible. What I primarily focused on first was making sure that we had something to put up on the blog. So when you saw Tony's tweets, what he posted up there, that just doesn't happen. That's a discussion among, how do you know, who are your sources? You know, are we going to have to back that up or not? And so, of course, trusting Tony's sources, making sure that we have enough verification, because what we're going to post is going to be extraordinary. We knew the responsibility that went with it. Then it was moving folks to Uvalde. So it's better to just, as you hear the term, flood the zone. It's better to have more people there, and then you can pull them back. So my number one call after Tony was to our photo editor. We needed to get as many visuals people down there as possible. The reporters will follow, because you can make calls from the road and try to do the reporting. You have anchors back who could just file stuff for online. So this was going to be a rolling story. But the number one thing is to get the visuals folks down there. We had an office manager who was looking to book hotel rooms. As Tony said, as we were making calls, you had to stay the farther away from town. We had folks in San Antonio who were driving to Uvalde. But so the number one thing is, how many people can we get there? And when we get there, we'll start positioning you where to go. The visuals team was real simple. Just get down there and start seeing where the vigils are, and if there's any families or any teachers or law enforcement, what you can get. And as far as, Lynn, when it came to the print paper, we had, I want to say our deadlines around, it's about 4:30 p.m., probably pushed it to like 6 p.m. So what we needed to publish in the print paper would have been something, this is the facts that we have now, turn to the Statesman for more information. This is what we can likely say going forward. And so it's a historical paper for the reasons of what happened, but know that by the time it lands in your doorstep tomorrow morning, in many ways it's going to be obsolete, because what you first have is maybe 14 have died, to when Tony goes on there, says the number's 21. So that's way past deadline. So for me, the steps were making sure that our people were down there, making sure they had a place to stay, and then when they were down there, who's going to go try to find police, family members? What do we know? One thing that we did immediately was, we knew it was Robb Elementary School, so we went on the school website and we downloaded. They have a teachers page, and they have police officers, everybody from the Uvalde Independent School District. So we downloaded every photo of every teacher and every police officer, knowing that this would come into play in some way or the other. We knew in law enforcement it would, because of everything that subsequently happened with the officers and the response. We also had the photos of the teachers, because several reasons. We knew there was teachers inside the classrooms, and we were going to try to find a way to talk to them, for them to tell us what happened, where were you when this happened. But we knew at least 2 of the teachers in those photos had died. So those would come for profiles.
So, just one more second on this with talking to your reporters. How do you strategize the next day so that you don't have reporters bumping into each other and just saying, hey, I talked to the police.
And that's what happened.
Well, we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
I talked to the state police, I talked to the mayor, I talked to the governor's now here, and I talked to the governor's press secretary. How do you get everybody in the right
Yeah,
vein?
yeah, and so it was without a doubt the first, it's always going to be, you want to minimize the chaos. And so it's like, okay, Tony's going to deal with his sources in law enforcement. We have reporters who were assigned to the governor's office, and the reporters who were down there just do what reporters do. Be on the streets, try to track down teachers, family members. We knew by then that he had shot his grandmother, try to find his house, try to find other teachers, go to the funeral homes. So in essence, it was just go gather intelligence to see as much we can get.
Tony, were you the straw boss of all the Austin statesman people, or?
Well, maybe, sort of. I mean, that's actually one thing well, I think that's, well, I mean, what did we have? Maybe 10, a dozen? I don't know
12.
exactly, yeah. I mean, that's one thing that I think is really important that I would say to journalists, particularly journalists who are starting in their career. And that is, in situations like this, it's really critical that you follow your own instincts about what you think is important to do. You're on the ground there. Yes, you can get some direction from your bosses, but keep in mind, in this situation, they were back in Austin. And I think that in some situations, they were waiting for maybe clear instructions to be given, or that's something that they wanted to have happen. But it's really difficult for an editor, who's many miles away, to know the landscape, to know, what are you, like quite literally, what are you seeing? Who are you seeing? I think it's just really important that you follow your own instincts. And if you see people, introduce yourself and start talking to them. Chances are they'll be willing to talk to you.
Well, let's talk about the talk. By the time you got there, the shooting was over.
Right.
Bodies were accounted for later that night, but they'd obviously gone into the classroom before you got there, right? There were lots of conflicting reports as to who did the shooting. Lots of conflicting reports as to were the students all in one room or were they in two rooms. Lots of conflicting reports about were the doors locked or were they unlocked. Lots of conflicting reports about what happened before the shooter even entered the building. Could he get into the building? Was it locked or was it wide open? I think that the chaos is just in details. It must be hellish to try to figure out, okay, one of the things that's clear in a lot of the reports, after action, as they say, is he comes in a pickup, he crashes a pickup, oddly, runs towards the school building, armed, and then somebody says, I'm sure you must have heard this in your first hours, there was a man dressed in black running towards the school with children around him, and you hear it on the 911 call. Can you talk about how you sorted all this out in those early hours?
Well, in those early hours, we didn't
The
know.
man in black turned out to be a coach,
Right.
right? Not a shooter.
So to say that this whole thing, from what officials were telling us to what actually happened, was frankly a cluster, is the understatement of the year, because that actually became part of the story, is how wrong they were from their initial statements and even their subsequent statements. But to your point, think of a Category 5 hurricane of information where it's just pounding you and pounding you and pounding you hour after hour after hour. And that's what it feels like to be a journalist in a situation like this. You hear this, and then you hear that, and then this contradicts that. And then the phone is ringing and it's someone from Austin and they heard so-and-so. And then a colleague over here heard something else. And then the source over here heard something else. It's insanity. It's quite literally insanity. But our job as journalists is to bring sanity and reality and facts to those situations. So I think it's really, really critical that we take a lot of deep breaths, and if we don't know, be honest that we don't know. We're not expected to know everything in those initial hours or even initial days. We do what we can, and yes, we want to be the first to break news, right? I mean, who doesn't want to be the first to break news? But we most importantly want to make sure that the news that we are sharing, particularly about something that's so tragic and awful and terrible, is right.
Any tips on how you sorted that out? How did you comb out things that you decided not to publish?
I mean, again, I think Manny and I were having a lot of
it was-
talks and a lot of conversations. You know, late that night, early the next day, late that night, early the next morning. I mean, those
Because
were.
you have to plan, you're planning for the next day too, because it's, at this point, it's a fait accompli. You have 19 students dead and your 2 teachers. But there was a lot of mistakes, so what I would share with you, especially students, is your best friend and your best protection when you're on a big story or any story like that is, and somebody's giving you facts, is to ask them, how do you know that? What's your attribution? How do you know that? Well, I heard it secondhand, firsthand, and it's, well, I know this, and how do you know that? Press for that. The other thing you can do that's going to help you a lot is when you're on a breaking story, any breaking stories, write down those facts and put yourself a timestamp. So it's just, if it's March the 6th, 4:20 p.m., this is the fact I got. Because you can always go back and refer to your timeline, and you can go back and vet that, because that's information you're getting. It was even from moments soon after the shooting, the governor held a press conference and identified the shooter as his first name and last name Romas. And we're watching the press conference, said, Romas? Whose last name is Romas? And we're thinking to ourselves, it's probably Ramos. He's just getting out the facts. I'm here, I got it. And it was wrong. So this is the reason, is what I go back to, when, and again, as students and as journalists, when you're covering a major event, slow down. That'll be your best friend. You don't have to be first. You want to make sure it's accurate, because accuracy is your credibility. So I always say, slow down, bring context to the story, but above all, use your common sense. And the other word is discernment. Discernment's going to be your best friend on these huge events, because there's going to be an incredible amount of pressure. And then, as Tony said, when the networks come in, Uvalde is a very small town, and you have every big name from TV, and there's a team behind them. So they may be interviewing somebody on camera, but they have a team that's done all the work for them. It's like a machine. Which goes to, I think, where do you find your story here? And this is why you leave it to the reporter. Use your judgment. You be a street reporter. You go see things and find people and find events. But it was very, very chaotic. Now, I will say we had help. One of the things that we learned from this is, what you want to do, for all of us who've covered big events like this, you put an editor on the ground. Somebody who can basically drive and lead the coverage, and can be your eyes and ears while all the reporters are out there. That came around 2 days later. USA Today gave us a lot of support. We're part of USA Today, the network, so reporters came in from other parts of Texas, from Arizona. My boss, Ray Rivera, who's in Oklahoma City, he ran the coverage. He sort of like was the point person to help guide. Because imagine, by then what we do, we have like Excel files. These are the dead, and we're doing profiles of them. We're not, even though families may have, or somebody may have posted something like a GoFundMe or on Facebook, we needed to have at least 2 verifications, independent verifications, before we ran somebody that they had passed away. So we had files on who passed away, the dead. We had an Excel file that continues to this day of every public record request we filed for information, 911 calls, body cam footage, text messages, what officers, what departments were responding, things that, there's a hearing on Wednesday for summary judgment. We've all sued the state to get these records, so there's a hearing Wednesday morning. So, in essence, my job was sort of step back and be the air traffic controller of all this while Tony and others did the work on the ground with the support that we had.
The first thing you think about in this whole tragedy as the weeks went on, and you hear the Austin American-Statesman, you think about the video. Put that into some context. The video was 77 minutes. Tony is in an unusual position that he has been a Statesman reporter for about 20 years and a TV reporter for 10 years with the ABC affiliate, right, in Austin. That may have had something to do with how you got the video, but set the scene. Yeah. How did the video come to you? The legislature had it. Obviously, law enforcement had it.
So those first couple of weeks, those first 3 weeks, I mean, our coverage was consistent and solid. We were doing what, frankly, other news outlets were doing with regard to, as Manny mentioned, profiling victims, trying to further the reporting in any way that we could. But we were learning, along with our colleagues at other outlets, about the law enforcement failures. I think a turning point for our coverage really started in June, early June. I had a law enforcement source who invited me to view a 77-minute video from a hallway camera from inside the school. And that video was extraordinarily significant because it showed in real-time detail the flawed law enforcement response. It showed basically cops standing around for more than an hour not doing a whole lot, just to be blunt about it. And so I was invited to watch this video. The agreement with the source was that I could report on what I had seen, but the source would not give me the video. I will say this is where some television training and work came into my brain, because I did negotiate with that person. Let me just, literally a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? I know it's a cliche, it's also true. So I negotiated in that moment with the source, at least let me take one screenshot of the video. And so we updated a breaking story, and actually, I'll show you, that evening, I'll just show you here. So yeah, this is an exclusive story that we did. Officers arrived at Uvalde with rifles and ballistic shields 19 minutes after the gunman. So this is the screen grab that I essentially negotiated with this source. So again, this is 19 minutes into this whole ordeal. And you can see there's a police officer to the left with a high-powered rifle like an AR-15. You can see right here they have at least one ballistic shield. And this was so important because it really showed that based on training that law enforcement officers received and have received since Columbine, the Columbine high school shooting, basically all law enforcement experts unanimously agreed at this point, this is 19 minutes into it, they had what they needed to enter the classroom and take on the gunman. But instead, almost an hour passed, 58 minutes passed from this moment at 11:52 before they finally stormed the classroom. So I think just watching the video, I knew then that the public had to see, come hell or high water, that video, because it was so extraordinary and so unusual, so unprecedented for us to have video that showed in such striking detail something like that. So over the next couple of weeks, I talked to anyone who might have that video, frankly impressed upon them the extraordinary need for the public to see that, so that there could be transparency around what happened, there could be accountability about what happened, and then ultimately we reached the point where we did get the video.
So when you would make those pleadings, what did they say back?
There was a lot of sorry, man. No, good luck with that. That was the most frequent thing that I heard. I would be violating X, Y, and Z law if I gave you the video. I would be fired if I gave you the video. There were any number of reasons. And the truth is, the number of people who had the video, while it was not single digits, it was not dozens of people by any stretch of the imagination. So I think the people who did have it were extraordinarily concerned that their fingerprints might be on it.
Manny, talk
Yeah.
about the calculations that went through your mind, and also you eventually do an edited version of the video.
Well, two things. So we knew, because the shooting had happened in a school, they had to have security footage. So that was something we asked for. So leading up to this was the first real chink in the armor, because within days, the state police started walking back the heroic narrative. So remember, this is one of the greatest failures of law enforcement ever. It didn't start out that way. It was a heroic narrative from the Secretary of Homeland Security to the Governor of Texas, state, federal, and local officials, all saying if they hadn't acted, there would have been more deaths.
That the police officer, the responding police officers put themselves between the gunman and the children. I mean, it was quite specific what
Put
they
themselves
want.
between the gunman and the children. So you have that. Then as they learn, they start walking it back. But there's one thing to say we could have done better, there was failings. Those are words. That is, so always remember, as journalists, ask, it doesn't matter if you work for a TV or multimedia or print. Do you have pictures? Do you have a video? That's the mother lode. So when Tony got that, we ran it. I remember when we got that picture, we ran it with the story on the front page too. We held the, and it was like a bomb went off, because finally you had something. Police got between the gunman and the children.
I mean, this photo, our photo, frankly, led network newscast that night.
Yeah, they did. So this was round one. Then speeding up, so we knew, because again, as a reporter, when you work your career to build trust and relationships with sources, doesn't mean you throw a towel, but when you establish yourself as a credible reporter, you build relationships. We knew that Tony would get the video. So what we did was, we had to circle the wagons and slow down. We had a very small group. We brought in our lawyers to understand what the SHIELD law was in Texas. What's the protections does a journalist have? And for their sources, A. B, very important, what is the universe of either people who have the video or have access to the video or may have copied it? Because you're also looking to protect that universe of people. Third is, what are we going to publish? And that's when Tony obtained the video, and then we're going to do a shortened version, and we were working with our television partner at KView, and the decision was we were going to run the entire video. And a key reason for that is because there's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there who believe this is a lot of crisis acting and this doesn't happen. So we were going to say, here's the entire thing. And so you can see for yourself just the level of failure, and then we go into the real, this is, Tony can talk about, but then when Tony makes the call, we've got it, it was a very small group of people who actually watched it because we wanted to keep the group small, and we didn't rush to publish immediately. In fact, if anything, as I mentioned earlier, we slowed the process even down, understanding what we had.
Which is a very difficult thing, if I can just, say that, because I think the instinct of anyone is to rush to get something like that out the door. But at the same time, the amount of decision-making that had to be put into all of the decisions, it was quite literally an editorial and ethical minefield, was very, very difficult. And I think, I can safely say neither one of us had ever faced any sort of decision exactly like that. But the way it all unfolded, I mean, I got a phone call late one night from a source who said, come get the video. And I'll never forget that day, that evening. And just to be really specific, it's so, at that point, you're trying so much to protect the source that, like, when I left my home that night to go quite literally pick up the video, I did not feel as though I could tell my husband, my spouse, like, where I was going. Like, we were keeping it that tightly to the vest. And then once I got it and we got it in hand, I'll never forget, to Manny's point, a small group of us were on a Teams call at 10 o'clock at night trying to begin our early conversations about what our editorial strategy would be.
How many days, weeks is this past the incident?
So we published on July 12th, and the shooting was May 24th.
Got it. Now, were you worried about someone else getting it and releasing it first, or the legislature, the governor releasing it to just stick a shiv in your sweet little plan?
I would not say it was a sweet little plan, by the way. I think it was a plan that we were, the politics, I still say, was very weird around all of this. The governor was on television saying that, pounding his fist, that video needs to be released. Well, he's the governor, right? He could have, in theory, put the steps in motion to release it. I think we were cognizant of competitive pressure. I don't think that was the primary thing at all that propelled us. But to be clear, every journalist in America who was covering Uvalde wanted that video, and not just wanted it for the salaciousness or the awfulness or the drama of it, but I would like to think that we were all being compelled by this idea that we frankly had been lied to consistently by officials, and that they had not been honest and they had not been transparent. And to get a little highbrow on us here, but what more meaning is there in being a journalist than to bringing truth to a situation like that?
So how did you plan this out? Talk about the two that you have. Not all of us realized until I started studying this a little bit, there was a 4-minute version.
Yeah.
There was a version also where you took the children's voices out, right?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, if you can, the decisions you made to present it.
So we brought in our standards and ethics editor, and the senior leaders from USA Today, just to watch it, or lawyers to watch it. And
This
then
is the entirety, all the audio, the whole.
the entire thing, everything we had, and our lawyers
read
wanted
it
to
all.
find out, how did you get it, what, and that's, this is the one thing when you have your lawyers saying, we will go to the mat on this, because this has to be out there. So because maybe not everyone wanted to watch the whole 77 minutes, so we had a much shorter video that just got to the point, key points. But a decision that we made pretty early on is, because when you're watching it, it's horrible. it was unanimous that we were not going to publish the sounds of the children screaming, because you absolutely hear that when he bursts into the classroom, he shoots in, and he just starts unleashing. So if families hear that, or anybody, they're not going to know. The families will go, it was that my child screaming that I heard. So we were going to block that out. But we decided we were absolutely going to run the gunshots, because this is what an AR-15 sounds like when it's killing people in a classroom. And then, even more critically important to keep the gunshots in, about 48 minutes into the video, you hear the gunman shooting. I think it's 4 shots, Tony?
While this army of cops, frankly, are standing in the hall.
So go back to the narrative of heroics. Police got between the gunman and the children. The discussion is, we didn't go in there because it's a barricaded suspect. He's barricaded. 48 minutes in, boom, 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 boom. They're all standing around. There's still no action from those gunshots till 21 minutes later when they go in. So now you're bringing context to the entire picture that you can't impeach, because there it is. Take it for what it is. It's the failure, and that you have that famous scene where one of them in like a jacket goes and uses hand sanitizer, and there's another one, there's a couple of guys who are going back and forth and they fist pump each other, but this is all well and good. And so we published, subsequently we've heard from folks who run SWAT. This is what all they've done is SWAT operations their entire career, and they've said they've never seen anything like this, because this goes against everything that you've ever been trained, ever.
Talk about, it's a detail, but an important detail in this video. They go to the classroom, then they walk back.
Right.
Right? And then there's always been this story, the doors were locked. He was barricaded. There's a procedure, right? I don't want to get into that just yet, but how did you report that the doors were locked? Did you have to back that off?
That had been part of our ongoing coverage, all of these details, like was the door locked or not locked, and that had been part of our body of work kind of leading up to this moment where we got the video. So we had done a lot of that sorting along the way, but then by the time we got this video, a lot of that had been in the public sphere at that point.
The 4-minute version, how did you come up with that idea?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it just we wanted to have something taught, and to the point that this hits the highlights.
Okay.
The 4 minutes
points.
illustrate the biggest key points, like when the officers first arrived, when they first accessed the room, when when more officers arrived, when the first ballistic shields arrived. Another big moment is that, like a few minutes after 12, they bring in this big case of like tear gas and put it down. I mean, you could just see these really pivotal moments up to and including that round of gunfire that Manny referenced, that we just wanted to give people those key facts. And we really certainly recognize that there would be many people who had no interest in watching all 77 minutes. But who definitely wanted to watch enough to understand the significance of the failures.
I want to get to questions, but before we do, I want to ask, once the video was out there, what was the effect? What were the repercussions of the reporting?
I think I can safely say it was horrendous. It was horrendous, and in some ways also, I think that we felt we had served the public by bringing truth and reality. It was extraordinarily painful for that community. It was even more painful, as you can imagine, for the family members who were learning so much of this in real time through, in this case, our reporting. And, you know, there were also people who did not want for the truth to frankly be out there. And I certainly don't mind saying that Manny and I, because it was ultimately our faces and our names attached to the work, to say that we received threats, we certainly did. Really horrendous threats. I do want to say to reporters out there, young journalists out there, and I'm not just saying this because he is sitting next to me. I've said this when he's not sitting next to me. Get yourself an editor, a boss, a news director, whoever, who is going to freaking have your back, because if you're doing deep work and meaningful work, you will face backlash. That's just sort of what happens and where we are. Manny, who was under siege himself, was calling me multiple times every day that week after to make sure I was okay, that I felt safe, you know, that I felt comfortable in my own home. And to have that level of support, I think, is really, really important. Had I not had that, I think I would have really kind of lost it because of the siege that I felt under, that we felt under.
What was going through your mind?
Excuse me. Well, we knew, so again, before publication, we knew that we were going to get pushed back. So we had a deep discussion, you know. In fact, I wrote a column, this is our reason for publishing this.
I'll show that, yeah.
Know that as we're leading on this investigation, the state has established a legislative committee to look into the Uvalde failure. The special state legislative committee was pretty much operating in secrecy. Most of the interviews that this committee was doing were being done behind closed doors. So the public, even the families of the children and the teachers, were not getting the full picture. And even, so we knew that we had to publish, knowing that there would be repercussions and there would be pushback, and understanding that it would cause pain, and that wasn't lost on us in any way. We felt it was necessary to show the level of the failure. Sure, we received threats, death threats. I've got calls and emails saying, if you have children, we hope your children die. Too, we hope you die. You know, it goes with the territory. It shouldn't be, but again, we were resolute in what we were doing and the importance of the work, because it could not be impeached, because it was accurate, and because it needed to be out there to show just how bad the failure had been.
How soon did the state release the video? After you did?
So the state released a portion of the video 5 days after us. Is significant because the state investigation was being done by members of the Texas House, so politicians, and it was a bipartisan committee, but they made different decisions than we did about what to make public. So for example, they never showed the gunman entering or walking down the hallway with an AR-15. They did not at all air any sound of gunfire. So they frankly made different decisions. We felt our job as journalists was to provide almost maximum transparency. We did, as Manny mentioned, make some editorial decisions with regard to screaming that could be heard on the video. There was also a small child. I think one of the most haunting parts of that video, I mean, it's all haunting, but one of the things that sticks in my mind is that you see a little boy come out of the bathroom and peek around a corner and see the gunman walking down the hall with this, you know, high-powered weapon. So you could see the child's face. Of course, we blurred his face.
Well, you hear the gunshots, and then the little boy runs back into the bathroom horrified. mention the NDAs that the legislature, because this is also true about the secrecy here, the non-disclosure.
Yeah, so just, we fought and frankly continue to fight against authorities who still to this day, we're 10 months out now from this event, who still have released very little information. And in fact, what we've learned through the course of our reporting is that Texas lawmakers have actually obtained the information, the Uvalde case file, but only after signing non-disclosure agreements. So in other words, they promised that they would hold the information as confidential and keep it private, which frankly raises questions for us about, well, on whose behalf are you working? The public at large, or law enforcement, or it was just a very highly unusual situation.
Well, it oftentimes is when they're under so much siege and criticism, law enforcement will circle the wagons, right?
They do.
Let's take some questions. Lots of good hands. There's a microphone coming around from one of our ambassadors. This one here on the aisle.
You mentioned that Uvalde is a smaller town than Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and I actually read in an article where it said you didn't realize that you were at the school until you were kind of on top of it. How did you, if you did interview parents or people who were familiar, who live in that town, how did you go about having conversations with them and making sure that you weren't taking time away from like them mourning?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think it's really important for us to talk about, how we talk to people in a grieving community, particularly family members in a grieving community. First of all, as journalists, we never want to do anything to cause more trauma or to further traumatize a person who was already in a traumatic situation. It is also our job to tell the stories of a grieving family or of a grieving community. And the difficult nature of that is you can only do that by asking them. And those are always, I've been a journalist now for 23 years, and what I have found over time is many people in situations like this really actually want to talk to a journalist. They want to share their stories. I think innately, sometimes we often think that, well, of course they have no interest in that. I find that very often they do. And so we want to make ourselves available to that. But, we certainly don't want to overwhelm them in the way we ask and in our approach. So I think it's just we do it very delicately. But it's important that we ask and give them an opportunity, I think.
It's empathy. That when you go into these communities, always remember that you're coming in as an outsider and show empathy. And what Tony said is correct. And we had the discussion among our staff too, just how much are we always stepping bounds going into this horrific tragedy and talking to families, talking to teachers. Said, well, that's the job that we have to do, because we want to be able to tell the story within context. But no, if somebody doesn't want to talk or something, we should step back. But I'll never forget in the middle of this, just the fact of being there, how important it is when we were having these discussions about whether someone should talk or not. Do we interview families? Ryan Atula, who's he was, again, throwing everybody down there. He was a City Hall reporter, City of Austin. And he just happened to be standing there, and there was a school teacher next to him. He says, "You look like you're from here." See, I'm one of the school teachers. And so she poured out her story. Her horror was being in one of the adjacent classrooms, and she realized she hadn't locked her door, which is supposed to do. And in waiting there for the drama, is he going to come into my classroom now? So again, you want to let the individuals who are the subject of the story guide things. You give them if you're willing to tell your story, we'd like to hear it, but always they should have the control and power over it.
Next question. Anything on this side? Dominic, then, over here?
Why was it you who got the security footage first rather than other journalists reporting on it? What were you doing differently?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that every journalist I know of who was covering Uvalde was making efforts to get that video. I was making efforts as well. I will say this. You know, when the big guys and women come to town, they often, you know, the CNNs of the world, as Manny sort of pointed out, they have a huge advantage. They have teams of producers and teams of you know, editors who are making calls from the ground in Uvalde or from New York or wherever they're from. I will say I've been a local journalist my entire career, local meaning Austin and Texas, right? And so I do think that gave me, and I hate to use the word advantage, but I do think it positioned me in a unique way because, I mean, ultimately the person from whom I got the video was someone I have known for a long time. And so I think that helped. I also think that years and years and years and years of hard work in one place helped kind of build a level of trust and confidence that, like, if we give it to him, he will do the right thing.
Another question. Go ahead, Dominic.
I wanted to ask about what the experience of kind of being a small fish in a big pond, kind of covering this with all these other publications that are coming from across the country, like you said, MSNBC, CNN, PBS, like all these other places. How was that experience being the one that drove 2.5 hours out of your own local coverage to go do that?
Well, I mean, I think it makes it very difficult. There's also, you know, the truth is what I mean, I kind of knew this, but this was amplified even more. I mean, the big networks also need local journalists, right? So, for example, in the first 2 months after the shooting, I counted, poor Manny's heard me say this 100 times, but I did 50 network interviews in the first 2 months. So I was on CNN and MSNBC and, you know, PBS NewsHour and NPR. I mean, I never said no to anybody. And so I think to their credit, yes, they have their own teams, but I think the national media also realizes the importance of local journalism as well and recognizes that local journalists are going to be uniquely positioned to get information that they're not. Manny, I don't know if you have other perspectives on that, but
I want to go back to your question why Tony got the video. I think what you do as a journalist, know this, that when you're working as a journalist over time, and if you're parachuting into a community or you're going to cover a beat, there will be a background, there will be a dossier on you. This is just normal. A lot of agents, it's not normal, but a lot of agencies are doing this. I've seen reporters who show up and says, yeah, I've been reading about you, they use a dossier on you. They use it to try to intimidate you and so forth. I think in Tony's case is because he has a proven track record of treating subjects of stories with fairness, dignity, and respect. He doesn't twist the knife, and he's fair, and you don't get sandbagged. So as a reporter, whether let's say you start your career here in Baton Rouge at The Advocate, or you're at the Austin American Statesman, or BRZ, or just wherever, the key thing is for you to just develop a reputation that you're accurate. You get your facts right, you're accurate. You treat the subject of your stories with dignity and respect, even at their worst moments. And it doesn't mean you pull punches, but you do a fair story, regardless of the platform. And that's how you'll build up the reputation. And Tony has done that over the course of his career. So I think when you have these moments, folks tend to go to Tony because of who he is and the way he's built his reputation.
Thank you for saying that.
Very true. Other questions?
I know a lot of the conversation after the video was released was about like how journalists can improve their reporting by like not blindly trusting law enforcement and other official sources. So what would you say, what kind of lessons have you learned about like, I guess, determining the validity of those law enforcement sources and other like official sources that journalists have been taught to just really trust and value highly? What would you say, like what advice would you give to other journalists who are trying to decipher what kind of information they should trust?
I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, we've seen, particularly over the past several years, I think of George Floyd and the press release that the Minneapolis Police Department issued initially after George Floyd's death was extraordinarily striking given the realities that we saw for our own selves about what happened. I mean, this situation was particularly, I think, galling, but given the number and position of the government officials who were telling us, you know, they were heroic. This would have been so much worse. I think, honestly, one thing, too, that was just really helpful is that we began hearing very early on from family members who are outside that school. There's social media video of them like screaming, like, why is this taking so long? Like, go in and get my kid. We did a big story, here, I'll show you, that deconstructed the hero narrative. This ran.
Yeah, this was a very important story.
Kind of deconstructed how the cops initially framed this and what the reality was. But I'll just scroll here because one of the really, I think, great things that we did is right here. I'm not sure why this is not loading on the left, but we transcribed what they were saying. This is all just, again, kind of open source social media video where, you know, the people outside the school are saying, what the hell? Like, why aren't you going in? And so we, again, I don't know why it's loading, but we transcribed what they were saying in these social media videos. And then we also, let me just find it here. Yeah, well, there's some more. So like you can see the cops basically tackled a parent who was insisting that they go in. But then we also, this was an important video. We did a montage, basically, of sound bites from law enforcement and other officials, basically saying they all repeated the same story of police heroism. So we, as part of our digital presentation, showed that as well.
So you hit on something which is, again, approach information that agencies or folks give you skeptically. You're a young reporter, you're in your first job. Happened to me as a general assignment reporter very early. The press release goes out, this is the police's accounting of the information. You write the story, according to police, this is what happened. It publishes. You know, sometimes you have the ability to go back and dig into that story and see did it really stand out that way. George Floyd is a classic example of the press release versus the video. And so there's things that part of bringing the healthy skepticism that we do is if you're covering a crime story, try to see if there is much talk on social channels, be it Reddit, Instagram, Twitter, and so forth, any video out there. Just try to do a scrub of anything that's possible that exists. And that doesn't mean you're going to run it, but at least knowledge is power. Try to gather as much information as you can. If you're fortunate enough to go back and be able to dig into a story, Or if you trust your gut as a journalist, there's a reason that says trust your gut. If something doesn't sound right, feel right, it violates just simple common sense, put it in your back pocket and look for a day where you're possibly able to go back and look at that case, examine it.
Excuse me, all really true. Really, really true. Other questions? Lots of hands. Let's take one right here. Where's the mic? Mind traveling over there?
Coming from a very heavily immigrated community myself, I would just love to hear about the language barrier that y'all experienced in Uvalde, with it being a heavily Spanish-speaking community.
I think that was a really important dimension of our coverage, and one of the things that really distinguished our coverage too is that some of the journalists we had on the ground, for example, were really aware of sort of the cultural traditions of funerals, for example. But we also were aware of the language barrier, acutely aware, so much so, in fact, that one of the things that we did is that when the Texas House released a very, 77, 80-page report, they did not translate it into Spanish for the community. And Manny, this was his project, so it's important for him to talk about it. But
So yeah, that special legislative committee I was telling you about that operated in secrecy. So they released this report on a Sunday, and Uvalde's primarily it's a Hispanic community, and over 53+% of the homes, a language other than English is spoken at home. So you can deduce it's Spanish. So when the committee released its report, it was in English. We had a reporter there, and families were saying, do you have this in Spanish? And one of the aides went like this. Again, watch out when folks tell you, well, this will take. So the committee says, well, we'll try to get it to you within a couple of weeks. And then the mayor of Uvalde says, it could take 2 weeks, maybe sooner. Well, where did you pull that from? 2 weeks, a couple of weeks, where do you get that from? They're just pulling it out of whole cloth. So I was watching the report, and having worked, I oversaw a Spanish language newsroom for 5 years. I knew we could turn that around like that. So I literally texted a former managing editor, Teresa, who worked with me in Miami. I said, let's start translating this. She was working for another publication, but she had been in Austin. And so we put together a whole team of translators. She translated the whole report. We had a copy edited, and we had it done in 3 days from footnotes. And then USA Today has a lot of bilingual journalists. So we copy edited, make sure it was actually pristine. And as I joke, and thinking, oh, okay, I'll try to find a copy place in Uvalde that maybe will run a couple of 100 copies. Nicole Carroll, the editor-in-chief of USA Today, turns to me and says, Manny, we own printing presses. And so we ran 10,000 copies and delivered 2 pallets to Uvalde on Thursday. So the report, they said this on Sunday. Thursday morning, Tony, me and a group of statesman journalists all drove down there. So they were delivered, of all places, to the Uvalde Police Department, and who kept it there. And I gotta say, they could not have been kinder and nicer. You can see the trauma and just the pain on their faces. The chief came out and thanked us, but they're walking wounded and for what happened. But we went around town and we distributed the copies everywhere. There was only one place, there was a bakery, said they didn't want it, but in restaurants, we went to all the funeral homes, churches, the library, we were welcomed and everyone accepted them. But again, it's that story, the reason it's serving the community in where it needs, credibly in its language too. And so again, that was part of the continuing false narrative of just causing more pain. But your point is extremely important, and this is why diverse newsrooms are critically important for so many reasons, language and culture, because that's what brings the credibility to the organization and helps your coverage, helps improve your
yes.
coverage, do it accurately.
Just to give us all a few reminders about the report. The report said there were 376 officers on the scene. It was uncoordinated. The incident lasted 73 minutes. There was no follow-up. They did not follow an active shooter guideline. If you want to talk about what that comes out of Columbine in Colorado. The officers retreated after they heard shots. They ran to the classroom like you saw and then retreated. Waited for backup for about almost an hour. This is all in the legislative report. No doors were locked. People came in, police went, various law enforcement went and got a sledgehammer. Keys became a big story. There was no need for keys. There was no need for a sledgehammer.
So all of this nonsense
Yeah.
is like for more than an hour, you know, they're looking at their phones, they're looking at diagrams of the school, they're trying to get a key to the classroom. It's quite literally a disaster.
The chaos. And then ultimately, the shooter was killed by border police who came from more than an hour away. 376 officers and border police, I don't know how many they were, came and eventually put an end to it.
Right.
Well, they said they killed them. We've asked, they haven't released the autopsy report.
Still,
They don't release it, they haven't released it, so they said they killed them. And we've been very careful trying to input as many of our stories that police entered the classroom and said they killed them. Because until we have proof,
and the conspiracy theorists, have they played around with this?
no, I don't.
I think we just want, the point of that is, did they kill him or did he commit suicide? That's really the unresolved.
But I'm not raising it as a conspiracy, it's just a matter of attribution.
Right. No, it makes perfect sense. A couple more students anywhere? Chick, do you want to ask a question?
So the reason they're giving you for not giving you the information, I mean, why aren't they letting you know the
There's not giving us what the autopsy?
Or any of the
Or any of it.
information. Yeah, so,
Why
It's,
is
it's
this-
part of an active investigation. It's
Of what?
the active investigation that they continue to do into the shooting, of more officers that need to be disciplined, reprimanded. There's a prosecutor, the Uvalde prosecutor, has been looking at supposedly, if there's gonna be criminal charges coming out of this. We don't see
There
it.
have been no criminal charges to
there's
this
been no
point?
criminal charges. at
No,
this point.
so that, it always, there's that, it's gonna excuse the active investigation statute. And then Texas has a statute that has to do with the dead, what is it, the dead?
Dead suspect loophole. So in other words, if the suspect is dead, the law allows authorities to withhold the information
Forever.
forever.
Pete Arredondo, what happened? He gets fired as head of the school district's police force. Is he still living in Uvalde?
As far as I know. So if you don't know that name, he was the police chief of the Uvalde school district police force who was the incident commander that day.
Although he doesn't think he was.
He says he was not.
More questions. Let's give some folks in the back a chance. Back here. There you go. There you go. Right there. She's got her hand up. Thank you.
You mentioned that the summary judgment hearing will occur on Wednesday. How do you plan to move forward with the story after that?
Well, in our dreams is that to release everything, and then it's all hands to get what we have and parse it out. Because it's sooner or later the truth comes out. It does. It does for everything.
But often not until there's a fight. And so that's the fight
The
we're
legal
waging.
fight.
Yeah.
And it's that we're a consortium with national outlets, our company, television outlets too, and all around the state, so we're not gonna go away.
Question over here.
So I have a question kind of about the initial coverage. So, do y'all think that they began covering about the police heroism and like gun control because of like kind of like norms after school shootings, or do you think it's because they knew that there was an issue?
I mean, I think the answer to that is, a matter of opinion. Did they set out to mislead the public? I mean, I don't know that I feel in a position to say that, or whether or not, they were victims of confirmation bias. What we can say unequivocally is that the story they told was not the truth.
This is why that, again, step back, because remember, an incident happens, there's a massive incident that happens, then what you do is you go back to that timeline I told you about where you look at all those facts. That's when you step back, and there's a lot. I mean, it's like a massive bowl of information, and then you step back and you look to put it all together and see how this makes sense. That's why that story that Tony mentioned on the false narrative is important, because we had a colleague too, this is the other thing that we did. We were capturing every tweet that was put out that night. Every tweet by somebody in authority, we were saving them, because what will happen, they'll delete. Now you can go to Wayback Machine if you learn about those tools and go back and pull some of this stuff up, but we wanted to have them, and what you saw was from the top levels of the federal government, cut and paste, retweet, retweet, heroics, 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 heroics. So think about just opening a faucet and it just comes out. Then what happened, it's all pouring out, the handle breaks. So you can't stop the flow of false information. So then we, in essence, become the plumbers of journalistic plumbers who have to come and shut that off and expose it. But this is why that story was important, because it happened so immediate. It had, for example, just as something as simple, little thing, as the governor identifies a shooter, Ramos. It's not Ramos, it's Ramos. And then all law enforcement officers, heroics. When you knew it wasn't there, what it's also critical is because in that false narrative story, look at all the videos of the families standing outside. Why aren't you going in? Why aren't you going in? Now it's not just journalists. These are the families' heroics. No, they were standing out there, so you're being disingenuous to them. But all that comes, again, with having time to be able to step back and do those stories.
Couple more questions, one in the back.
Here.
I just had a question about concerning the video. How long exactly did you have the video in your possession before you decided to release it? And why did it take so long to release?
Why did it take so long for us or for the officials?
For y'all.
For us. So I think we had in our possession roughly 48 hours from the time it was in my hands to we shared it with the world. Much of that time was considering all of what we would and would not show. I mean, keep in mind, this was like nowhere previous in journalism history has there been a video quite like this that not only showed an awful, tragic, horrific shooting inside a school, but also the meltdown, the breakdown, the colossal failure of the police. And so when you are weighing questions like, are we going to show and air more than 100 rounds from an AR style 15? I mean, I can't think of any decision in my career, and I'm sure Manny would probably agree, that has been so fraught with, difficulties, frankly. And so, to his point, we wanted to take our time, yet at the same time, we did not want to be in a position where we were just sitting on for days and days, information that was being so demanded by the public.
Well, it was also, it continued to reinforce this false narrative. So it was, again, the reason for the delay also is we wanted to watch it. We had our visual directors looking at it to make sure was anything cut in there, just to make sure the integrity of it and where it started. So again, it was a lot of large, compact group, but looking at it and studying it. What do we run? I was writing a column on it too, but just, we wanted to make sure also the slowdown was to understand the repercussions to how would it impact folks. A lot of the stuff, that legal ramifications I told you about, the shield law, we had a Texas lawyer and our associate general counsel, who both happen to be former journalists. What's our protection? Making sure he's protected, making sure sources are protected.
Because there was a concern that the district attorney would possibly try to get me in front of a judge or a grand jury to say, where and how did you get this video? And so we wanted to make sure, we were prepared for that to the extent that we could be.
Or they could have, I suppose they could have tried to enjoin you from publishing it, right? You must have
That
thought about
was a
that-
possibility,
that
yeah, we considered that as
possibility, too.
well. Yeah.
Sure.
They would go to court right away, and like in the Pentagon Papers, they were
Right.
going to try to stop the Washington Post and the New York Times from publishing the Pentagon Papers. Any more questions? Julie?
You saw this video and you published this video. Have you seen other videos from inside the school? And in your reporting from whatever videos you've seen or are trying to get, do you have an understanding of what caused them to retreat? Was it simply waiting for backup, or was it fear? Do you have an understanding?
We don't. I mean, the truth is, the simple answer according to them is that they got it wrong. They thought that, or wanted to believe that he was in a empty classroom. That's why they treated it as a barricaded suspect as opposed to someone who was in a classroom full of kids, full of fourth graders. I still think it's one of the great unanswered questions, though, from that day, just in terms of, what was the mindset of everyone else there? What did they know? What did they not know? What did they understand or not understand about what was happening? I think so much of that is that, we'll have to read their statements if we're ever entitled to see them, to really be in their shoes, to have them explain it. There are many other videos that have been released subsequent to our reporting, body camera footage and things like that, but nothing that really fully says, here it is.
Yeah, it's chaotic. So from the experts who watched the video that we interviewed and others we've heard from, there's a false sense of security. So if you watch the video and even the subsequent videos, there's a lot of officers in vests and helmets and assault rifles. That's just been given to them. They don't have the training, so it gives a false sense of security, which I learned from talking to some SWAT commanders. And what the ones that we've talked to all agreed to, there was a failure, whether, I don't know if it was a Redondo or somebody on the scene, to take control and says, we're going in. And again, I've talked to top SWAT commanders in our country who've said they can't fathom this. He goes, it's not even it. In fact, one of them described to me as muscle memory. You just go to the door, kick the door in, and open fire. And it wasn't a macho thing. You're saying, this is what you do. You go in there and you know where the guy is, you have a general, and you shoot. It's overwhelming force. There's nothing to discuss. And the whole retreat, lack of training, and so it became this groupthink where it's the paralysis of analysis, and until those if those reports ever come out, and we'll understand it, but ultimately, the other question that we tried, no one will ultimately be able to answer. We tried, Tony did a story on it. We know there was 4 that were still alive when police went in there. Where they would have survived, we don't know. One of them was a teacher. She passed in the parking lot, and then you had 3 others.
Yeah, 3 of the kids, yeah.
So 3 of the kids, at least, were pulled out after. Where they would have survived, we're not sure, but at least they had a fighting chance. So did the teacher. We know that the teacher was calling her husband from the classroom. There was a teacher that many have interviewed, Nulfo, who was alive and on the floor. He's given an incredible account of being in the classroom and waiting for folks to come in, and no one's doing anything. And subsequently, you've heard as from children whose 911 calls have been haunting.
I want to end it there, but I'll ask you a question. Journalists of any longevity, stories stay with you. Manny, how has this story changed you as an editor?
Well, for me, it's the defining story, and I've been doing this for it's going to be 33 years. It's a defining story for me, and I've had many moments, but this for me is, I knew it was meant to be at the Statesman, and this was a very important moment. It's a defining moment for me because of what it showed, just the failure, and it's also a defining moment because of the importance of journalism and why we matter more than ever, and to work with colleagues like Tony Plohetski, who've dedicated their careers and their time and their craft, and also the impact on our families, because we spend a lot of long hours, and I thanked Tony's husband, Ro, who's a mensch, who just is a great guy. So it'll stay with you because of its importance.
Tony, how do you feel about it?
I think it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I mean, in my professional life, and maybe the second hardest thing in my life. But to echo what Manny said, I think that for me, it was just an extraordinary moment of confirmation about the absolute significance of what we do as journalists. And it's just a reminder also, I think, to get the damn video. Every time, get the video.
Get the document.
Get the documents. Yeah, all of it, yeah.
We're going to end it there. However, Tony's going to queue up the 4-minute version of the video. If you want to stay and watch that, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, thank you so much. This has been a powerful and emotional account of journalism and Uvalde and what we try to teach here. So I really appreciate it. And
Congratulations to all of you, too, for being journalism students here at LSU, and thank you for coming to hear us.
Great. I'll leave it to you to cue this up, and if you want to stick around and watch 4 minutes of this, you're welcome to do it, but thank you very much, and we're adjourned.
All right, man.
And,
I'd love to get some feedback on the. Sure will.